You are tired in a way that sleep no longer fixes, not the ordinary tiredness of a long day, the kind a good night erases. This is the tiredness that is still there in the morning, waiting for you before you have even stood up. You sleep and you wake, and the fatigue has not moved. It sits behind your eyes and underneath your thoughts, and it has started to feel less like a state you're passing through and more like a person you have quietly become. There is a particular texture to it. Small tasks feel enormous. An unread message sits unanswered for days, not because you do not care, but because answering it seems to cost more than you have. Things that once gave you pleasure feel strangely flat. You grow irritable with people you love and then ashamed of the irritation, which quietly cost you more energy still. You're not sad exactly. You're worn to the point where feeling much of anything at all has become expensive. For a long time we called this laziness, or weakness, or a simple failure of will. We told people to try harder, to push through, to want it more. That advice landed on the one system in the body that had already been pushing for months and had nothing left to give. It is a little like shouting at someone to run faster whose legs have already buckled underneath them. And here is the first surprise. The people who burn out are very rarely the ones who never cared. They are far more often the ones who cared the most, who pushed the hardest, who kept saying yes long after a wiser instinct would have said no. Burnout is not what happens to the weak. It is more often what happens to the committed, when commitment is asked to run without limit and without any rest. What is happening inside a burned-out brain is not a shortage of effort. It is a physical change in the organ that produces effort. The tissue behind your forehead, the small structures buried deep in your skull, the chemistry that carries your moods and your motivation. All of it has been quietly reshaped by something that went on far too long. Burnout is the name we give to the end of that process. The World Health Organization now lists it as an occupational phenomenon, a syndrome that grows out of chronic workplace stress that was never brought under control. It tends to show up as three things at once: a deep depletion of energy, a hardening distance and cynicism toward the work itself, and a creeping conviction that nothing you do is any good. Those three are not passing moods. They are the visible surface of something structural underneath. Here is the part that sounds impossible. The very system that burns you out is the same system that evolved to keep you alive. The machinery of stress was built to rescue you from a threat lasting seconds. Burnout is what that rescue machinery does when the threat never ends, and the machinery is never once allowed to switch off. So what is that machinery actually doing while it runs? What changes inside the brain when a survival response meant for moments is left running for months on end? And why does the exhaustion at the far end of it reach so deep that ordinary rest cannot seem to touch it? If you enjoy following questions about the mind and the brain that produces it, a like would be highly appreciated. And if something here stirs a question of your own, or an experience you want to put into words, the comments are open for exactly that. With that said, let's get back to the topic. So before we watch this system fall apart, let's watch it work. Start with the version of stress that works, because it is the same machinery, and it is genuinely on your side. Imagine the oldest emergency your body knows. Something shifts in the grass a few feet away from you. Before you have even named it, your heart is already beating harder. Your muscles are already loosening for a sprint. Your pupils have widened and the world has gone sharp and narrow and slightly slow. You did not decide any of this. A set of ancient circuits decided it for you in a fraction of a second, long before the thinking part of you had any chance to weigh in. And they were right to. This is the acute stress response, and it is one of the most useful things a body can do. Its whole job is to take a calm animal and turn it, inside a single heartbeat, into one ready to fight or to flee. The first command comes from deep in the brain, and races along a fast set of nerves straight down to the adrenal glands, which sit like two small caps on top of your kidneys. Those glands release adrenaline. Within a second or two, the whole body is armed and ready, running on a chemistry it did not have a moment before. Think of a sprinter crouched in the blocks at the start of a 100-meter race. Everything in that body is tuned for one short and violent effort that will be over in 10 seconds. The heart pounds, the lungs heave, fuel pours into the blood. Every spare system has been powered down so that nothing at all is wasted. But no sprinter alive is built to hold that state for an entire afternoon. The whole design rests on one quiet assumption. The race is short and the rest comes after. Your stress response rests on exactly the same assumption. It floods you with everything a brief emergency could possibly demand, and it fully expects that emergency to be over soon. This is where the comparison starts to matter. A sprinter chooses to step onto the track, runs the race, and then walks off it. Your stress response can be set off without your choosing anything at all. A message that lands in your inbox can trigger it. So can a worry that surfaces on its own while you lie in the dark, hours after the working day has ended. A neurobiologist named Robert Sapolsky spent years out on the plains of East Africa, watching wild baboons and tracking this exact machinery in animals living hard and anxious lives. His central observation became the title of his best-known book. A zebra being chased by a lion runs the full stress response at maximum. Then, if it survives the next few minutes, it simply stops. The response switches cleanly off, and the animal goes back to grazing as though nothing had happened at all. A human being can switch that same response on while sitting perfectly still, thinking about a conversation that has not happened yet, or one that happened years ago. The lion is imaginary. The cortisol is entirely real. And unlike the zebra, we rarely let the response fully end. The person who first saw the shape of all this was Hans Selye, a young physician working in Montreal in the 1930s. Selye was not looking for stress. He was injecting rats with extracts made from cattle organs, hoping to discover a new hormone, and he kept accidentally ruining his own experiment. His rats fell ill in the same way no matter what he injected into them. Their adrenal glands swelled. Their stomachs developed ulcers. Parts of their immune defenses shrank away. Baffled, he began exposing the animals to things with no hormone in them at all. He tried cold. He tried toxins. He tried simply handling them roughly. And the very same pattern of illness appeared every single time. Selye slowly understood that he had stumbled onto something general. The body did not keep one response for cold, and a different one for poison, and another again for injury. It ran a single response to being overwhelmed, whatever the source happened to be. He borrowed a word from engineering to name it: stress, and he described the way it unfolds in 3 acts. First, an alarm, as the body mobilizes for the threat, then resistance, as it digs in and adapts to a pressure that has not gone away. And at last, if that pressure still never lifts, a stage he named Exhaustion. Sit with that 3rd act for a moment, because it is where this whole story is heading. Selye watched it arrive in his rats almost a century ago. Push the system long enough and something that began as a rescue starts instead to cause harm. The response that once saved the animal slowly begins to wear it down from the inside out. But to understand how a survival reflex curdles into damage, we have to follow the slower of its 2 arms. The fast jolt of adrenaline is only the opening move. Behind it comes a second signal, chemical and patient and far more consequential, that does not simply fade away when the moment passes. This second arm of the stress response is slower, and it is the one that matters most for burnout. Adrenaline is spent within minutes. If stress truly ended there, no one would ever burn out, and this would be a much shorter story. But behind the fast electrical jolt sits a second system, a chemical one, working on a far longer clock. It was built not to react to a threat, but to carry the body through one that lasts. Its main product is a hormone called cortisol, and to release it, the brain runs a line of command that is 3 steps deep. It begins in a small region at the base of the brain called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus sits at the crossroads between the brain and the body's hormones, and when it judges a threat to be real, it releases a tiny chemical message. That message travels only a very short distance, down to the pituitary, a gland about the size of a pea hanging just beneath it. The pituitary reads the message and answers by sending a hormone of its own out into the general bloodstream. That second hormone travels the length of your torso, all the way down to the adrenal glands, the very same ones that fired off the adrenaline, and it orders them to release cortisol. Picture how an instruction actually moves through a large company. The director at the top does not walk down to the loading dock and heave the boxes onto the truck herself. She writes a short memo and hands it to a manager. The manager turns that memo into a formal work order and passes it along to the warehouse floor. Only then, at the third step, does the product finally ship. Each level speaks only to the next one below it, and the thing that at last moves out of the door is several steps removed from the person who first wanted it to happen. Your stress hormone travels along that same 3-step route. The hypothalamus is the director with the memo. The pituitary is the manager who turns that memo into a signed and binding order. The adrenal glands are the warehouse floor that finally ships the cortisol out into your blood. Biologists have a name for the whole arrangement. It is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis for short, and you can picture it simply as the slow chemical spine of the stress response. Where the company comparison breaks down is reach. A warehouse ships its product to one address at a time. Cortisol ships to almost every cell in your body at once, because nearly every cell you own carries a receptor built specifically to receive it. And cortisol does a great deal once it arrives at all those doors. Above everything else, it is a mobilizer. It pulls stored sugar out of your tissues and into the blood, so that your muscles and your brain have fuel ready to burn. It sharpens your attention onto the threat in front of you. It quiets down every system that can safely afford to wait, folding back digestion and long-term repair and parts of the immune response, so that the body's resources pour toward the emergency instead of toward the future. In a real and passing crisis, all of this is exactly right. Cortisol is the hormone that lets you keep functioning through a threat that outlasts a sprint, through long hours rather than a handful of seconds. Cortisol is not only an emergency signal though. Even on a perfectly calm day, it follows a natural daily rhythm. Its level climbs in the last hours before you wake, reaching a peak shortly after you open your eyes, giving you the lift you need to rise and meet the morning. Then it falls away across the afternoon and the evening, sinking to its lowest point in the deep of the night, when the body is meant to be repairing itself rather than mobilizing. This rise and fall is one of the quiet clocks your body keeps running in the background. Hold that daily curve in your mind, because chronic stress does something to it that helps explain why a burned out person can feel exhausted and wired at the very same time. So far, this is still a system doing its job and doing it well. Consider the healthy sequence on its own terms. A threat appears somewhere in the world. The fast arm of adrenaline fires first. The slow arm of cortisol follows close behind it, and between the two of them the body is carried safely through whatever it faced. The design only turns into a problem because of what is supposed to happen next. A healthy stress response does not merely know how to switch on, it knows, just as precisely, how to switch off. And the way it switches itself off is one of the most elegant arrangements in the entire body, which is exactly why its slow failure ends up costing a person so much. A stress response that could only switch on would eventually kill the animal that owned it. The switching off matters just as much as the switching on, and the body manages it with a loop that quietly watches its own output. Cortisol does not only travel outward to the body, it also travels back up to the brain that ordered it in the first place, and when it reaches the brain, it presses on the very structures that started the whole cascade, and it tells them to stop. Rising cortisol reaches the hypothalamus and the pituitary and calms them both. Less message goes out, less cortisol comes back. The hormone the system produced becomes, a moment later, the very signal that shuts the system back down. This is what engineers call a negative feedback loop, and it is the same simple principle that keeps countless machines from tearing themselves apart. A thing produces an output. That output is measured, and the measurement is then used to reduce the very thing that produced it. The loop is self-correcting. It is always pulling itself back toward a set point without anyone standing over it to intervene. Think of the tank of water hidden behind a toilet. When you flush, the tank empties and a valve opens to let fresh water flow in and refill it. As the water rises inside the tank, a hollow float rises along with it, riding on the surface. When the float reaches a certain height, its arm pushes the valve shut. The water stops at exactly the level you wanted, without a single moving part ever being told what to do. The tank fills itself, and then it stops itself, using nothing more than its own rising water as the signal to quit. Cortisol behaves like that rising water. The higher its level climbs, the harder it pushes back against the structures that release it, until it quietly shuts off its own inflow. The system is built to return to stillness entirely on its own. Where the float valve comparison falls short is in the number of sensors. A float valve senses only one thing, the water beneath it. Your brain has several sensors for cortisol, and the most important of them is not sitting down in the plumbing at all. It sits much higher up, inside a structure far better known for something else entirely. That structure is the hippocampus, a curled ridge of tissue folded deep inside the brain, one on each side. It is best known for its role in memory, in laying down the record of your days, but it holds a second job that rarely gets mentioned in the same breath. It is one of the richest cortisol sensors in the entire brain, densely packed with receptors that read the level of the hormone circulating in the blood. And when it reads that level as high, it sends out a signal of its own that presses on the brake, telling the hypothalamus to ease off. A great deal of how your stress response knows when to finally stand down runs through this one small folded structure. In a healthy person, this whole shutoff is quick and clean. A stressful hour spikes cortisol. Then, within a couple of hours of the pressure easing, the level has already fallen back to its resting baseline. The spike is meant to be a spike, sharp and brief, not a plateau that goes on and on. The entire design quietly assumes the hormone visits and then leaves. Nothing about the system was ever built for a world in which cortisol simply moves in and stays. There is a striking piece of everyday medical evidence that this feedback loop is real and strong. When a patient takes a synthetic version of cortisol as medicine, in the steroid tablets prescribed for asthma or serious inflammation, their own feedback loop reads all that hormone in the blood and concludes the body must already be making plenty, so it shuts the natural supply down. The adrenal glands, no longer asked to work, grow quiet and begin to shrink. This is exactly why such medication can never be stopped all at once. It has to be reduced slowly, across weeks, to give the sleeping loop time to wake back up and resume its own production. The brake is powerful enough that simply borrowing cortisol from outside can switch the whole internal factory off. Hold on to all of that, because it is going to matter enormously before this is over. The structure that helps switch off your stress response is the very same structure that cortisol, in large and lasting amounts, is able to injure. For now, though, simply picture the healthy loop working the way it was designed to. A threat appears. Cortisol climbs. The body is carried through the hard hours. The hippocampus and the other sensors read the high level and press down on the brake. Cortisol falls back, and the whole system settles into rest, cleaned out and ready for the next real emergency whenever it comes. This is stress working perfectly, beginning to end. Now take away the single thing the entire design quietly depends upon. Stop letting the threat ever end. Everything up to this point has quietly assumed the threat ends. Modern life is full of threats that simply do not. A deadline is not a lion. It does not charge at you, get resolved in a few violent seconds, and then leave you alone to recover. It sits on your chest for weeks, and behind that deadline waits another. Behind that one runs a steady stream of smaller pressures that never fully clears. The bills, the messages, the low background sense of always falling a little behind. To the ancient machinery inside your skull, none of this looks any different from a predator in the grass. It cannot tell a genuine emergency apart from a meeting at 9 in the morning that makes your stomach tighten. It knows only the signal to switch on, and lately that signal almost never stops arriving. So cortisol, which was meant to spike sharply and then fall away, instead stays high. A system that was built to run in short bursts is forced month after month to run continuously. At first, the brake still holds. The feedback loop keeps trying to do its job, keeps pressing down, keeps attempting to shut the cascade off. But the cells that are supposed to read cortisol are now being asked to read a high level of it all day and all night and every day after that. And they begin to respond the way any receiver does when a signal refuses to ever change. Think of a phone that will not stop ringing. On the first day you answer every call, alert to each one. By the second week, when it has not fallen silent for a single hour, you stop even reaching for it. The phone is still ringing, exactly as loudly as before. You have simply stopped responding to it, because a signal that never varies and never stops carrying any information worth acting on. Your attention protects itself by tuning the whole thing out. The cortisol receptors in your brain do something unsettlingly similar. Bathed in a hormone that never recedes, they begin to pull back. The cells reduce the number of receptors they display on their surface, or the receptors that remain grow steadily less responsive. The hormone is still being shouted through the blood, and the brain has quietly stopped picking up the call. Here the phone comparison breaks down, and the difference is the whole problem. Ignoring a ringing phone costs you nothing important. But when the brain stops responding to cortisol, it loses its grip on the very loop that shuts the hormone off. The brake goes soft. Cortisol climbs higher and lingers longer, which dulls the receptors further still, which weakens the brake again in turn. Remember the daily rhythm of cortisol, the clean curve that peaks as you wake and sinks in the night. Chronic stress flattens that curve. The sharp morning peak that should lift you out of bed goes missing, so you wake already tired, with no chemical push to start the day. And the deep nighttime low that should let the body rest never fully arrives, so the system stays half switched on right through the dark. This is the exhausted and wired state that so many people try to describe. Too flat to rise easily in the morning, too activated to properly rest at night. The clock that should rise and fall has been pressed down into a straight and joyless line. A neuroscientist named Bruce McEwen spent much of his long career naming and measuring this exact cost. He worked at Rockefeller University in New York, and he came to dislike the word stress precisely because it had grown so vague that it could mean almost anything at all. He wanted a sharper term, one for the specific wear a body takes on when its emergency systems are switched on too often and held on for far too long. He called it allostatic load. Allostasis is the body's real talent for holding itself steady by changing. It means mounting a response and then, once the threat has passed, standing all the way back down. Allostatic load is the hidden bill that comes due when the standing down stops happening, when a response that should have been brief quietly becomes the new baseline. McEwen's deepest insight was that the damage of chronic stress is not really done by the stressful events themselves. It is done by the body's own response to them, left switched on with no working off switch. The cortisol that saves your life in a crisis turns slowly corrosive when it never once clears, and it is now washing continuously and without pause over an organ that was never built to sit soaking in it. Over the months that follow, that endless chemical tide begins to change the brain itself, one region at a time, and it starts with the part that makes you most recognizably human, and that happens to be the most fragile of all under this particular flood. Behind your forehead sits the newest and most delicate part of your entire brain. And it is the very first part to suffer. This is the prefrontal cortex, a thin sheet of folded tissue pressed up against the front of your skull. It is the part of you that plans ahead, that holds a goal steady in mind, that resists the easy impulse in favour of the wiser and slower choice. It is where you keep a phone number in your head just long enough to dial it. It is where you weigh a hard decision, where you bite back the thing you would regret saying. When people describe feeling sharp and focused and in control of themselves, they are describing this one region quietly doing its work. And it is exquisitely sensitive to cortisol and to the other stress chemicals that ride into the brain alongside it. Even a short, sharp burst of stress can knock the prefrontal cortex partly offline within minutes. You have certainly felt this happen. The mind that goes utterly blank in an exam, the words that vanish in the middle of a heated argument, the fumbling for a familiar name while someone stands there waiting for it. In each of those moments, the prefrontal cortex has been turned down, and the faster and blunter and older parts of the brain have taken the wheel instead. For a brief and real emergency, this is genuinely useful. Careful deliberation is a luxury when something is charging straight at you. Think of trying to work out a difficult sum in your head while a person stands right beside you, shouting random numbers into your ear. The calculation itself was well within your powers only a moment ago. Now you cannot hold the figures still in your mind long enough to add them together. Nothing has happened to your underlying ability to do arithmetic. The shouting is simply drowning out the quiet and careful internal process that the work depends on completely. Stress chemicals do to the prefrontal cortex almost exactly what that shouting does to the sum. They flood the region with signals that scramble the delicate, sustained firing that careful thought requires in order to hold together. For a passing stress, this lifts again the moment the pressure ends. But burnout is not a passing stress. When the flooding goes on for month after month, the change stops being a temporary dimming and starts becoming physical and structural. The neurons of the prefrontal cortex begin, slowly, to pull in their own branches. A neuroscientist at Yale named Amy Arnstein has spent decades mapping exactly how this unfolds. Her work shows how the chemicals of stress, present in high enough amounts for long enough, weaken the connections between prefrontal neurons and drive those neurons to physically retract. It helps to remember that a neuron is not a simple dot or a point. It is shaped far more like a tree, with a vast spreading crown of fine branches that reach out to receive signals from thousands of its neighbours. Under prolonged stress, the branches on the prefrontal neurons begin to wither back toward the trunk. The tree loses its finest twigs, and fewer branches means fewer connections, which means a region that can no longer quite manage its own careful work. There is a second consequence beyond the fog, and it reaches directly into how you treat the people around you. A well-functioning prefrontal cortex is what lets you pause before reacting, hold your temper, choose the patient word over the sharp one. As its grip weakens, that pause grows shorter and shorter. The impulse arrives and reaches action before the slower judgment can catch up to it. This is why burnout so often arrives with a shorter fuse and a run of choices you would not normally make. It is not that you have somehow become a worse person. The part of you that quietly edits your first impulse has simply lost some of its strength, and more of your raw first reactions are now making it through unchecked. This is the physical basis of a symptom that every burned out person knows intimately from the inside. The brain fog, the forgetfulness, the strange new inability to concentrate on something that used to feel effortless, to plan out a week, to hold any plan together at all once it is made. It is not imagined, and it is not a moral failing. The very tissue that does that work has physically thinned, and as it thins, its firm control over the rest of the brain begins to loosen its grip, which quietly sets the stage for the next change, because the prefrontal cortex does not only think and plan, it also restrains, and there is an older structure sitting just beneath it that has been waiting this entire time to be let off its leash. Deep in each side of the brain, tucked below the thinking cortex, sits a small almond-shaped cluster called the amygdala. It is your threat detector, and under chronic stress it does not weaken. It grows stronger. The amygdala is old, and it is fast. Its job is to scan everything pouring in through your senses for anything that might signal danger, and to raise the alarm before the slow and thoughtful cortex has even finished looking. It is the amygdala that makes you flinch at a shape in the dark before you consciously register that it is only a coat hung on a door. It works in fractions of a second, and it deliberately errs on the side of fear. A brain that mistakes a stick for a snake loses only a moment. A brain that mistakes a snake for a stick can lose everything. Over millions of years, the cautious version won. In a calm and rested brain, the amygdala is kept in careful check by the prefrontal cortex sitting above it. The thoughtful region acts as a steadying hand on the alarm, testing each warning against reason and quieting it when the threat is not real. It is a partnership between two parts of one brain. The amygdala sounds the alarm, and the prefrontal cortex decides whether that alarm truly deserves to be believed. But you've just seen what chronic stress does to the prefrontal cortex. It thins, it weakens, its branches wither back. The steadying hand grows unsteady, right when it is needed most. And here the endless tide of cortisol does something to the amygdala that is the exact mirror image of what it did to the region above. The same chemical flood that made the prefrontal neurons pull in their branches makes the amygdala neurons do the opposite. They grow, their branches thicken and multiply, their connections strengthen and deepen. The threat detector does not wear down under months of stress the way the thinking brain does. It quietly builds itself up, becoming larger and louder and more easily set off. Think of a guard dog that was trained to bark at intruders. Kept in a calm and settled home, it barks only rarely. It barks only at something genuinely worth barking at, because someone it trusts is always nearby to say enough and settle it back down. Now imagine that same home filled with real alarms going off for months on end. The dog is never once stood down. It begins barking at the wind and the mail and passing shadows and at nothing at all. There is no longer any steady hand resting on its collar to quiet it. In time, barking simply becomes what the dog does. It has been trained by the chaos around it into a permanent state of alarm. Your amygdala is that dog. Under months of unrelenting stress, it grows more sensitive and more reactive, exactly as the region that used to calm it grows weaker and quieter. Where the comparison breaks down is time. A frightened dog can be retrained and reassured within an afternoon. A remodeled amygdala has physically grown new structure, and it takes far longer than an afternoon to settle back down. This is a large part of why a burned out person feels permanently and inexplicably on edge. Small things trigger a response wildly out of proportion to their size. The ordinary morning message that would once have been a mild annoyance now lands like a genuine threat, because the structure sitting in judgment of it has been physically rebuilt to see threats almost everywhere. This overgrown alarm reaches deep into the night as well. A threat detector that has been rebuilt to fire easily does not politely switch off at bedtime. It keeps scanning the dark for danger, keeps the body a notch too alert to fall away into deep sleep, keeps surfacing the worry you had almost managed to set down. This is why so many burned out people lie exhausted and yet wide awake, unable to drop off even though every part of them is aching for rest. The very system that most needs sleep in order to recover is now the one standing guard against it. And a brain that cannot sleep properly loses its best nightly chance to clear cortisol and repair, which feeds the whole problem forward into another tired day. So the balance inside the brain has quietly tipped. The reasoning region is fainter and the alarm is louder, and a person in this state is running much of their life on raw threat. But the cortisol is not finished yet. It is now about to reach the one structure that might have slowed this whole cascade down, the very same structure you met earlier as one of the switches that shuts the stress response off. And what the flood does to that structure turns the entire process into something that feeds and accelerates itself. You have already met the hippocampus once tonight as one of the sensors that helps switch the stress response off. It is also the part of the brain that lays down new memories, and it is one of the most vulnerable places that cortisol can reach. The hippocampus is where the events of your day are first written down, before being sorted and filed away for the long term. It is also, unusually, one of the very few places in the adult human brain that keeps producing brand new neurons across your entire life. Fresh cells are born there week after week, and they matter a great deal for learning and mood and the flexibility of memory itself. This quiet, ongoing birth of new neurons is one of the small wonders of the human brain, and it is also easily disrupted. Cortisol, in the high and unrelenting amounts that chronic stress produces, works against this place in several ways at once. The very receptors that made the hippocampus such a fine cortisol sensor also make it a target. Under a lasting flood of the hormone, its neurons begin to pull in their branches, the same slow withering already seen up in the prefrontal cortex, and the birth of those new cells begins to slow. The nursery quiets. The steady renewal that kept the structure flexible starts to stall. Think of a garden bed where new seedlings push up out of the soil each season. Given ordinary weather, they sprout, take root, and slowly fill the bed with green. But leave a hose running on that same soil for months, until the ground is waterlogged and soured and starved of air, and the new shoots simply stop coming. The earth that was once fertile turns hostile to new growth. The older plants struggle on, and the new ones never arrive at all. Nothing is torn out in a single violent afternoon. The bed just grows barer season after season, because the quiet conditions that new life depends on have been washed clean away. The constant cortisol is that endless running hose, and the hippocampus is the bed that slowly stops producing new growth beneath it. Where the garden comparison breaks down is what else this particular bed happens to hold. A garden only grows food. This structure also holds the shut-off valve for the very flood that is drowning it. And that is exactly where chronic stress becomes something far worse than the simple sum of its damage. Remember what the hippocampus does for the stress response itself. It reads the level of cortisol in the blood and presses down on the brake, telling the brain that it is time to stand down. But now that structure is being steadily worn down by the very cortisol it's supposed to be sensing, a weakened hippocampus reads the hormone less clearly. It presses the brake less firmly, so the stress response is shut off less and less effectively. Cortisol rises higher and lingers longer, which wears the hippocampus down further still, which weakens the brake again. The damage has quietly become its own cause. The system that was meant to end the emergency is being disabled by the emergency, and with every turn of the loop it pulls a little tighter. This same wearing down of the hippocampus is one of the threads that quietly links chronic stress to depression. In people who have lived under prolonged stress, and in many people with long depression, brain imaging has found the hippocampus measurably smaller than you would otherwise expect. The direction of cause and effect is still argued over, and it is genuinely complicated. But the overlap is real. It hints that burnout, at its deepest, shares a great deal of its machinery with the low and flattened states we already understand far better. The organ is not being poetic when it sinks. It is running short on the very tissue that helps hold a mood upright. This is why burnout, once it has truly taken hold, is so terribly hard to simply push through by force. It is not a straight line that willpower can shorten from the outside. It is a loop that feeds on itself, and each full rotation makes the next one easier to fall into. Memory begins to suffer in plain daily ways. The past few weeks feel foggy and strangely far away, and the events of today refuse to stick. And the mood that a healthy hippocampus helps hold steady begins, slowly, to sink. Which brings us to the last and in some ways the cruelest change of all, the one that quietly removes the very thing that might otherwise have pulled a person back out. The ability to feel that anything at all is still worth the effort. There is a system buried in the brain whose entire purpose is to make things feel worth doing. And chronic stress slowly turns it down. Threaded through the deep brain is a set of structures that run on dopamine, the chemical of wanting and of pursuit. Together they form the reward system. When you anticipate something good, these circuits fire and produce the pull of motivation. A warm meal ahead of you, a message from someone you love, the finish of a long and difficult task. Each one lights the same engine, the felt sense that the effort just ahead is genuinely worth making. Dopamine is not so much the pleasure itself as the engine that drives you toward it. It is, in a real sense, what gets you up out of the chair in the first place. Under sustained stress, this system slowly loses its charge. The continuous cortisol and the strain it places on the surrounding circuits blunt the dopamine response, and especially the eager burst that normally arrives when you expect something good to happen. Studies that measure this directly find the reward signal in the deep brain arriving weaker and weaker under long stress, particularly in the moment of anticipation. The reward itself is still there, waiting out in the world. The brain's own signal that a reward is worth chasing grows fainter, until for some people it barely seems to arrive at all. Think of a favourite meal that is slowly losing its flavour. It is not spoiled or inedible. It is only fading, until the dish you once looked forward to tastes of almost nothing, and eating it becomes something you simply do rather than something you enjoy. You still know somewhere in memory that it used to be good. That knowledge just no longer connects to any live feeling. The plate in front of you and the pleasure it once reliably delivered have quietly come apart from each other. This is close to what a dimmed reward system does to the whole of a life. Things you used to genuinely want start to feel oddly flat. Anticipation goes quiet. The pull toward the next good thing weakens and thins. The clinical word for this is anhedonia, the slow draining away of pleasure and desire, and it is one of the heaviest weights a burned-out brain is forced to carry. Where the flavour comparison breaks down is speed. Real flavour comes back the moment you are well and hungry again. A blunted reward system takes real time to recover because the change is written into the circuitry itself, not into the meal on the plate. There is a particular cruelty hidden in the order these changes arrive. The one thing that might drag a person up and out of burnout is motivation. It is the willingness to rest, to seek help, to change the very conditions doing the harm. And motivation is precisely the thing the dimmed reward system has taken away. A person who could still act no longer feels that acting is worth it. This is why telling a burned out person to simply take a holiday so often falls flat. The reward machinery that would let a holiday feel good has itself been turned down, so even the rest fails to land, and the flatness follows them onto the beach. The way out is real, but the burned out brain has quietly lost the signal that would tell it the way out is worth walking toward. This is also the point where the 3 signs of burnout stop being a simple list and start being a single connected mechanism. The exhaustion is the depleted, cortisol-soaked body and brain. The cynicism, that growing distance from the work and from other people, is what the world honestly looks like through a threat detector turned all the way up and a reward system turned all the way down. And the sense that nothing you do is any good is the plain and direct voice of a dopamine system that no longer registers your efforts as worth very much. The psychologist Christina Maslach spent much of her career carefully documenting these 3 faces of burnout from the outside through surveys and interviews with many thousands of workers. What the neuroscience quietly adds underneath her work is the machinery, the reason those 3 faces so reliably arrive together and in that order. Now set all of the changes side by side and look at what they form together. The thinking brain quieted, the alarm amplified, the memory and mood center worn down, and its own brake disabled from within. The engine of motivation turned steadily off. Seen as a bare list, it looks like a brain simply falling to pieces at random. But it is not random at all. Every single one of these changes happens to point in the very same direction, toward one shared outcome. And once you can see that outcome clearly, the whole exhausting process stops looking like a breakdown and starts looking uncomfortably like something the brain is doing on purpose. Set the separate changes side by side one last time and look hard at what they add up to. Together, they do a single thing. They stop you. A thinking brain that can no longer focus or plan. A threat system that makes the whole world feel dangerous. A reward system that has drained the point out of every effort. A body flattened by an exhaustion that sleep will not touch. Line them all up in a row, and their combined effect becomes unmistakable. Together they make it very nearly impossible to keep going. And that, strange as it may sound at first, is probably closer to the point than to the malfunction. Consider what a burned out state actually forces a person to do. It forces them to withdraw, to stop taking on anything new, to pull back at last from the very demands that have been driving the stress response for months. The exhaustion that will not lift, the flatness, the fog, the shortened temper. All of it pushes hard in the same single direction, toward stopping. The brain, unable to make the outside world let up, has begun shutting down its own capacity to keep answering that world's endless demands. Think of the circuit breaker wired into the wall of a house. When too much current is drawn through the wiring, the wires themselves begin to heat, and heat inside the walls is how a house catches fire. So the breaker is built to do exactly one thing. When the load climbs too high for too long, it trips, and it cuts the power to everything downstream of it. The house goes suddenly dark. It is deeply inconvenient, and it feels for all the world like a failure. But the breaker did not fail. The breaker worked. It sacrificed the lights on purpose in order to save the wiring behind the walls from burning the whole house down. Burnout has very much the shape of a breaker tripping. Faced with a load it cannot carry, and unable to switch that load off at its source, the brain begins cutting its own power to the systems that keep you engaged and striving and moving forward. The bottomless exhaustion is not only wear and tear, it is in large part a withdrawal being imposed on you, precisely because you would not impose it on yourself. Where the comparison breaks down is speed and precision. A breaker trips in a hard instant and resets with the flick of a switch. The brain trips slowly, across months, and it cannot be reset with any flick at all. But the underlying logic is the very same. This is a protective shutdown, arriving far too late and far too bluntly to feel anything like protection. You can see the same logic playing out across the animal world, which is part of why it looks built rather than broken. An animal that loses a long series of fights, that is cornered and defeated again and again with no escape, does not keep fighting forever. At some point it goes still. It withdraws. It stops competing, stops foraging with its old energy, and pulls back into itself. For a long time this looked like simple defeat, a system failing. But there is a strong argument that it is a strategy, an old and conserved one. When effort keeps meeting no reward and no escape, the safest thing an animal can do is to stop spending energy on a fight it cannot win and wait for the world to change. Withdrawal buys survival when action only brings more harm. A burned-out human being is running a version of that same ancient program in an office rather than a forest. The demands keep coming, the effort keeps meeting no relief, and somewhere beneath awareness the brain reaches the same old conclusion. Stop spending. Pull back. Wait. The tragedy is that the modern world rarely lets the program work the way it was meant to. The forest animal that withdraws is usually left alone to recover. The person who withdraws still has the deadlines and the bills and the inbox waiting exactly where they were, often with a fresh layer of guilt stacked on top for having faltered at all. It would be too neat and not quite honest to say that burnout is purely a clever safety mechanism doing its job well. A great deal of what happens along the way is genuine wear, real damage to real living tissue, and none of it should be romanticised. The honest statement is narrower and stranger than that. The same machinery that evolved to protect you inside a short crisis, when it finds it cannot end the crisis, will in the end protect you from the crisis by taking you out of the fight altogether. It cannot stop the deadlines from coming, so instead it stops you. The collapse that people experience as a deep personal failure is in large part the body enforcing a rest it could find no other way to take. This reframe matters for far more than comfort. If burnout were simply a tank of energy run dry, the cure would be obvious and useless. Just refill the tank. But it is not a fuel gauge sitting on empty. It is a set of specific physical changes in a living organ, changes the brain made deliberately in response to its conditions, following rules we're only beginning to read. And anything the brain built in response to conditions, it can also begin to unbuild once those conditions genuinely change. The branches that withered can grow back out. The question left is what recovery actually is, down at the level of the tissue, and the answer turns out to be far more hopeful than all of the damage might suggest. The changes of burnout are real, and they are physical. They are also, for the most part, reversible. This is the finding that changes everything about how to hold the whole idea of burnout. The withered branches on the prefrontal neurons, the overgrown and overreactive amygdala, the slowed birth of new cells in the hippocampus, the dulled and unresponsive cortisol receptors, the flattened reward response. Not one of these is a permanent injury in the way that a severed limb is permanent. They are the current shape of a living and constantly changing organ, and when the conditions that produce that shape finally lift, the tissue slowly begins to move back toward how it was before. In careful studies of animals held under long-term stress, researchers watch the prefrontal neurons pull in their branches exactly as expected. Then they let the stress come to an end. Given a real stretch of recovery afterward, those very same branches grew back out again. The lost connections reformed. The tissue that had thinned under the pressure quietly rebuilt itself once the pressure was gone. The receptors that had gone silent slowly became responsive once more. The whole system, given genuine relief, drifted back toward its own balance without being forced. Think of a patch of grass worn down to bare brown earth by people cutting the same corner day after day after day. As long as the feet keep falling on it, nothing will grow. The ground stays packed and hard and lifeless, and it looks for all the world as though it has been ruined for good. But reroute the path and put up a low rope and simply stop the trampling, and something very quiet begins to happen. The soil slowly softens. Thin green blades start to push up through the dirt. Given a single season of being genuinely left alone, the bare patch fills itself back in, almost as though no one had ever walked across it at all. Your brain recovers along very similar lines. Stop the trampling, and the worn ground slowly comes back to life on its own. Where the grass comparison breaks down is in what stopping the trampling actually requires. Grass needs only to be left alone. A burned-out brain needs a good deal more than the mere absence of new stress. It needs real sleep, which is when a great share of the brain's actual repair is carried out. It needs true recovery, rather than the thin and anxious rest of a weekend spent quietly dreading the Monday. And above all, it needs the source of the stress to genuinely change, because the self-tightening loop you saw earlier will simply pull closed again the moment the flood of cortisol returns. This is also exactly why recovery from burnout is so slow, and why it cannot be hurried along by willpower any more than the collapse itself could be resisted by willpower. Growing new branches, and calming an overgrown alarm, and restoring a worn-out feedback break are all physical processes. They run on their own patient clock, one measured in weeks and months rather than in days. The person who expects to feel entirely whole again after one long weekend has simply misread the nature of the injury. But slow is not even remotely the same thing as impossible. The direction of travel, once the load has genuinely been lifted, is toward repair. It helps to be concrete about what genuinely lifting the load looks like, because vague advice is part of what fails burned-out people. The single most powerful repair tool is sleep, real and sufficient, because the deep stages of the night are when cortisol falls furthest, and the brain does much of its physical rebuilding. Close behind it is anything that reliably switches the stress response off for a while. Slow breathing, time out in nature, movement that is not punishing, the company of people who make your nervous system feel safe. None of these are indulgences. Each one is a stretch of hours in which the flood recedes and the tissue is finally allowed to begin its work. But the deepest lever is almost always the hardest one. It is the source of the stress itself. You can sleep and breathe and walk and still slide back down if the conditions that drove the whole cascade are waiting untouched on Monday morning. This is why recovery from burnout so often demands changes a person has been avoiding for months. A boundary finally drawn, a workload finally refused, a conversation finally had. The biology is patient and forgiving, and it will rebuild what was worn away. What it cannot do is rebuild while the same flood is still running. Relief has to be real, and it has to last before the branches will trust the ground enough to grow, which returns us, at the very end, to where this whole story first began, to the tiredness that ordinary sleep could not seem to fix. Because there is a reason that tiredness points so insistently towards sleep, and there is a reason this particular understanding of it belongs to the quiet minutes just before you get there. You began this in a state you can now understand from the inside. The tiredness that greets you before you have even stood up, the fog that sits over your thoughts, the strange flatness where wanting used to live. You know now that these are not the signs of a weak character or a simple failure of effort. They are the honest readings on an organ that has been carrying an emergency response for far, far longer than it was ever built to carry one. The exhaustion is not your enemy. It is the truthful report of a brain that has been protecting you the only way it still had left, by making it impossible to keep sprinting a race that was never going to end. And the organ quietly reading these words to you right now is the very same one this whole story has been describing. The cortisol and the thinned branches and the loud amygdala and the dimmed reward system. These are not happening to some distant stranger in a textbook. If you are burned out, they are happening behind your own eyes as you listen. And so, already, is the slow beginning of their repair. Every structure that was worn down is in principle able to grow back. The tissue is listening even now for the flood to finally stop. There is a fitting symmetry in where all of this leaves you tonight. The very state that chronic stress erodes is the same state in which the brain does the greatest share of its mending. While you sleep, the stress response sinks to its lowest point of the entire day. Cortisol ebbs away. The muscles let go of a tension they have been holding since the morning. The overgrown alarm finally settles. The worn structures are handed the one condition they need more than any other, which is a long stretch of hours with no threat left to answer. The night is when the brain quietly unbuilds what the day's endless emergency built. The rest that burnout makes you crave so desperately is also, exactly and precisely, the rest that begins to undo it. Think, for a moment, of what your brain has actually done for you. For months, maybe years, it stood at its post. It kept sounding the alarm, kept mobilizing fuel, kept you upright and moving through days that asked far too much of it. It did not do any of this to punish you. It did it because keeping you going was the only job it truly knew. And when even that became impossible, it did the last protective thing left to it. It began, gently and against your will, to make you stop. There is a strange tenderness buried in that, once you can see it clearly. The very collapse you have been fighting and resenting was your own brain, trying to save you from a race it could see you would not leave on your own. So be a little gentler with the tired organ behind your eyes tonight. It has been working without rest for a very long time. It has earned this rest, and so have you. There is no shame anywhere in a body that has finally insisted on stopping. It is not broken, and you are not broken. You're simply an animal that ran its emergency system too long, and now, slowly and at last, you're being made to rest. So the tiredness that would not lift was never only damage. It was also an instruction, written in the only language the body had left. It pointed you steadily toward the dark and the quiet and the long, slow repair that happens down inside them. A brain that forces you to finally stop is not a broken brain. It is a brain still doing, clumsily and at great cost, the one thing it has always done since the very first day of your life. Trying against everything to keep you alive. Tonight, if you possibly can, let it. Let the emergency end for a few hours. Let the flood recede. Let the alarm that has rung since first light fall quiet at last. Let the branches begin, cell by patient cell, to reach back out into the dark. The organ that spent the whole long day sounding an alarm it could not switch off can finally, now, be allowed to stand down. If this was worth the quiet it asked of you, I would be glad to have you back again for the next one.